Hi. So in this tutorial, we're going to be talking about Wekinator and using Wekinator as an actual example and how to use Wekinator, since you already know the structure of how to connect GSAPP to Wekinator together. This is a simple example. It involves morphing a tower into these different shapes. And if I move the slider on one side, it's like a short and wide faceted tower. As I move it up, it's less faceted. The number of slides changes, and so it morphs between two different versions. And I haven't calculated how exactly it will morph. I've just told Wekinator what I want at each given position, and it calculates the rest. And so this is one simple example of how to use Wekinator, and just the general concept of Wekinator. Given a series of examples of inputs and outputs, I can tell Wekinator what my ideal things are. I can train Wekinator, and then I can then use Wekinator to have it predict given outputs. So I'm going to start by opening Wekinator, and in this case I already have a Wekinator running just to show you this example, but I'm actually going to restart Wekinator and do this from scratch. And I'm also going to turn on the GSAPP How to Wekinator processing program that I mentioned before in the last tutorial. So we need to create a new project. I'm going to use 1 input and 4 outputs. And Wekinator is now running. And I'm just going to arrange my viewport and check to make sure that Wekinator is receiving everything properly. So if I move the input slider, OSCN comes in. That's great. So this example 2 is a little bit more circular. It's the same structure as before, but the first step is to create a 3D model to train Wekinator with. The second step is to send values to Wekinator via processing, or send values out via OSC, use the processing script, receive data from Wekinator, or do Wekinator, receive data from Wekinator, and then receiving prediction input from Wekinator to change the 3D model. And in fact, it should be just number 6. So we have this kind of a circular process. And so the first example that I'll just show you is I've created a 3D model. It's inside a cluster, and you can double click again on clusters to see what's going on. And the cluster just creates a tower of sorts. And the reason why, especially the nice thing of used a cluster, we'll come back to this more, but I have one cluster and I have the second cluster, which are all connected inside of each other, so I can create one tower to train Wekinator with, and one tower or 3D model or GSAPP script to receive prediction input from Wekinator. So you notice that these inputs are all connected to this 3D model. So if I move these sliders around, the GSAPP model changes. And so I have these outputs. And I know it's a little bit confusing of why these are called outputs when they seem to be changing something in the 3D model. And that's because this is inputs and outputs from Wekinator's perspective. What Wekinator does is it receives a pair of inputs and outputs. You say, here's a state I want. I want when my inputs are like this, I want my outputs to be like this. And you give it a bunch of examples of what you want it to do as an ideal. And you train it on those examples. And then, and after that, then you can run it based on those previous examples, and Wekinator will try its best to magically, automagically, or really statistically understand what you want based on the input. So here's one simple example. I'm going to say that, let's say we want Wekinator to magically morph between a few different states. Or let's say 2 different states for now. We'll add another state. I want a short, squat tower or building or form, and then I want it to, when this is low and when this is high, I want a different state. So when I'll set input 1 to 0, and you'll notice that these outputs, these go in, these are sent themselves as a UDP message, and that's because these outputs will actually control how the sliders are moving around. So when we set this output, we're also setting the desired output in Wekinator, and this is really convenient more than anything. So once we do that, we can click on Start Recording. And so the way Wekinator works is you have this window, and you can see these 4 outputs are what you want Wekinator to predict in the future, what you want it to output when it's actually doing something. And so, and on the left you have all these different buttons, and these represent things you can do to train Wekinator, start recording values, train Wekinator on the values you've recorded, and run Wekinator. So here, I'm going to click on Start Recording. And I have this input and these outputs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jiggle this input around, kind of move it around, and you can see these numbers increasing. And what that means is Wekinator is saying, I have received 38 examples, and saying, when you input 0.0565, Wekinator understands I'm supposed to output these things. And as I wiggle this around, because I'm continually sending messages, Wekinator is continually receiving a bunch of messages as input-output pairs. So let's say I have these 56. I can click on Stop Recording. So that's, I've recorded one set of training values of what my inputs are, and what my outputs are, and what I want Wekinator to predict and understand. And so the second set is I'm going to set the slider to the end, and let's say when that slider is to the end, I want my form to be narrower, let's say a little taller, maybe a little more taller, a little twisted, maybe I want it to become less faceted. Okay, so that's what I want it to look like when the slider is over here. So I'm going to click on Start Recording. And so I can keep on recording, and you can see the examples keep on increasing. But let's say actually, I did something wrong. So I clicked on Stop Recording. I can say Delete Last Recording, and these numbers reset back to 56. So I can kind of undo a recording step because say I wanted to adjust something just a little bit. Great. So I click on Start Recording. Now I move the slider around, and the samples over here, 72, 75, 78, they keep on increasing. Let's say I keep on going until I have 100 samples. And stop recording. So this means right now I have 106 examples, or samples, training set examples of what, based on a given input, what the given output should be. And so if I click the train button, it's the magic part, it says V1, so now there's a version 1 model of what it thinks it should do. If I click on run, this is the fun part. Now it's running. So what it's doing is based on the model it's trained on, now it'll try to predict. So if I move the slider around, you can see that the sliders over here automatically kind of move around. They're moving based on the examples I gave. And so not only does it just move around, this sends data back to Grasshopper. And you can see 0.29. So these things are being influenced by Grasshopper. And if I take these values and then use that cluster before to plot them, there it is. So here's a purple, and the purple is the results of our prediction. And Wekinator is controlling this. I can move the single slider, and it'll automatically morph between those given states. And so I haven't written any algorithm or any math or any kind of components to say, hey, when it's like this, do this. I've just given Wekinator examples of what I want it to be, and Wekinator tries to figure it out. Now you might be wondering, oh, this is interesting, but this is basic morphing. I could do this with math or some other way. So let's try to actually, I'm going to stop recording. Let's try to do something else where, let's say, in the middle, when we're in the middle of our morph, we want it to actually do something different. Let's say we want it to become really big and super twisted and really tall. So I'm going to move the slider around, and I'm recording a whole bunch of more examples. So now I'm adding another kind of set of desires. I'm saying, hey, when it's in the middle, when this input is in the middle, you should give me this output, Wekinator. So if I click on train, Now it says V2, so there's a second model. Now if I click on run, you can see that in the purple model, or the purple form, if I move my slider, it starts from that previous like short and squat form to more faceted, twisted, and then it morphs towards the ideal tower. Again, this is really interesting because Wekinator has no idea. I've never programmed anything. I've just given it examples and it figures out what it should do. So this is the basic way to use Wekinator. You give it examples, you train. And I know this is pretty simple. It's morphing between one shape to another. But I would imagine what gets really exciting is when you have a lot of different inputs. So let's say you generate a piece of geometry and you can analyze 20 different aspects of it and turn it into 20 inputs. So a piece of geometry has a volume, has an area, has a number of vertices. And then in the outputs, you choose, for example, the outputs correspond to shape a new form. And so what that means is you could, for example, have a given series of examples you've already chosen of when I model a sphere, I want you to give me a pyramid, and when I model a teapot, I want you to give me a rabbit, etc., etc. And so if you keep on setting up as many examples as possible, and then understanding your when I give it a sphere and understanding it as 20 inputs, and teapot, rabbit, if you model that as outputs, then you have the capacity to create a tool or frame in which Wekinator is predicting the relationship between your inputs and outputs, and then being trained on the relationship between your inputs and outputs, and then predicting what your output will be based on an input. And so I would highly recommend thinking about this in a machine muse or METATOOL context. What kind of operations or examples or tools can you generate that, based on a given set of inputs and outputs that you've already created, tries to predict or to generate or to suggest or to hint at interesting possibilities for the designer.